So let's begin with the axial region of the skeleton. It seems reasonable to make our way from the superior to inferior part of the axial division, so we'll look at the skull first. The skull bones can be categorized as either cranial bones or facial bones, and in total we see that there are 22 bones that belong to the skull. The cranial bones are the bones that are directly supporting and protecting the brain. They also serve as sites of attachment for muscles of the head and the neck. There are 8 bones in the cranial division, which we'll cover in just a few moments. So the cranial cavity is the cavity that is formed by the cranial bones, and this space is mostly occupied by the brain and its accessory structures. So the cranial bones consist of the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, ethmoid, and sphenoid bones. Now, some of these bones are paired, which means that there is a right and a left bone, and we count those right and left bones as separate bones in our count for the number of cranial bones. The facial bones have no direct role in supporting and protecting the brain. Instead, the facial bones house the special sensory organs, such as those belonging to the eyes, the ears, or the nose. These bones also contain passages for food and air, and we also see that the facial bones contain the upper and lower jaws, and the upper and lower jaws secure the teeth. The skull is, for the most part, a very immovable configuration of bones. However, the lower jaw, which is a bone called the mandible, is the only movable bone of the skull. So of the 22 total skull bones, there are 14 bones that belong to the facial division. The smaller cavities within the facial bones contain some of the special sensory structures, like the eyes, the ears, and the nose. So for instance, the orbital cavities house the eyes. The nasal cavity contains the sensory as well as the filtering structures that belong to the nose. The middle ear cavity contains the middle ear bones, as well as the tympanic membrane, which is also known as the eardrum. And the facial bones also contain the oral cavity, which is the mouth. So although this bone is not directly connected to the skull, it's within close enough proximity to the skull that we can discuss it here. This bone is the hyoid bone. It is a unique bone in the body because it is not directly connected to any other bone. Instead, it's anchored by ligaments to the temporal bone of the skull. The hyoid serves as a movable base for the tongue, and it also has attachment points for neck muscles that raise and lower the cartilage of the larynx when we are speaking or swallowing. So now that we have discussed the skull bones, let's continue our look at the axial skeleton by examining the vertebral column. The vertebral column is also known as the spine or the spinal column. It consists of 22 individual bones that are called vertebrae, which extend from the base of the skull to the pelvis. It's approximately 28 inches in length in the average person. And we also saw that the skull, we discussed earlier, the skull was a rather rigid and immovable structure. The vertebral column is not like this at all. In fact, we find that it's quite flexible, thanks to the discs that are found between most of the vertebrae. And it also exhibits several curvatures as well. There are 5 major regions of the vertebral column, with each region having vertebrae that have shapes that are unique to that region, that are different from vertebrae in other regions. Beginning superiorly, the 7 vertebrae within the neck are collectively called the cervical vertebrae. Moving inferiorly, the 12 vertebrae that support the ribs are called the thoracic vertebrae. The 5 vertebrae that are found in the lower back are collectively called the lumbar vertebrae. And the final 2 vertebrae are actually found near the pelvic bones. The first is the sacrum, and it's a triangular shaped wedge that's found between the 2 pelvic or the 2 hip bones. Its function is to transmit the weight of the vertebral column to the pelvic bones, and its wedge shape functions to prevent slippage between the right and left pelvic bones. Developmentally, the sacrum begins as 5 individual bones, and in an adult skeleton, these bones have all fused together into a single piece of bone. The coccyx, which is the last of our vertebrae, is the inferiormost bone of the vertebral column. In the fetal skeleton, the coccyx begins as 4 separate bones that fuse and unite together into a single piece of bone. Its function is to provide some support for the organs that are found in the pelvic cavity, as well as to serve as an attachment for muscles on the posterior side of the pelvis. Overall, the vertebral column functions to support the skull as well as protect the spinal cord. Because of the presence of the intervertebral discs, as well as the curvatures that we see when we observe the vertebral column from the lateral sides, the vertebral column also acts as a spring to absorb shock. It also allows the column to be mobile, particularly in the neck, the thoracic, and the abdominal regions. So with a few exceptions, many vertebrae have a common structural pattern to them. Each vertebra consists of a body, which is also called the centrum, which is located anteriorly. On the posterior side of the body of the vertebra is an arch, very appropriately called the vertebral arch. The body is the weight-bearing region of the vertebra. The vertebral arch is a composite structure that's formed by 2 pedicles and 2 lamina. The pedicles form the junction between the body of the vertebra and the remainder of the vertebral arch. So if you imagine the vertebral arch as a house shape, the pedicles act as the walls of the house and the lamina forms the roof. So together the body and the vertebral arch enclose an opening that's called the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen forms a channel down the vertebral column that houses the spinal cord. Emerging from the superior and inferior aspects of the vertebral arch are structures called the superior articular processes and inferior articular processes. So on the superior articular processes are smooth surfaces called superior articular facets. The same goes for the inferior articular processes. They have smooth surfaces on them called the inferior articular facets. The inferior articular processes of each vertebra form movable joints with the superior articular processes of the vertebra immediately below that one. Therefore, successive vertebrae join both at their bodies as well as the articular processes. The superior and inferior articular facets are the surfaces, the smooth surfaces, at which the joints between the adjacent vertebrae are formed. On the lateral side of adjacent vertebrae are small openings that are called the intervertebral foramen. These are the openings in which the spinal nerves can emerge from the spinal cord and fan out to the many parts of the body that those nerves serve. Recall that the sacrum is a wedge-shaped bone that's found between the 2 hip bones, while the coccyx is a small triangular bone that's found at the inferior end of the vertebral column. The sacrum transmits the weight of the vertebral column and all of the weight that the vertebral column is carrying to the hip bones. It is wedge-shaped so that it does not easily slip between the 2 pelvic bones. The coccyx serves to support some of the organs within the pelvic cavity, as well as providing a site for muscle attachment. So all of the bones of the sacrum fuse together during development, so that is, during development of the fetal skeleton, they begin as 5 individual bones, but in the adult skeleton, all of those 5 individual bones are fused together into a single piece. So therefore, we count them as a single bone in our count of the vertebrae in the vertebral column. The same applies for the coccyx. Developmentally, in the fetal skeleton, the coccyx begins as 4 individual bones, but then later on fused together. So therefore, we count the coccyx as a single bone as well in the adult skeleton. So counting the sacrum and the coccyx, this brings our total count of the bones in the adult vertebral column to 26.